political pop and cynical realism styles. One of the best examples, I think, is Wang Jinsong's work. And many assume also that the pop references in many of these works is really related to Warhol. But I actually think that many of these artists were referring to a much bigger popular culture movement, which is the Cultural Revolution in China from 66 to 76. Here you have a decade in which art and politics certainly were enmeshed, but there was a much greater self-conscious adoption of popular forms of visual culture. So we have here with Wang Jinsong a direct reference to a much earlier painting from 1964, but very much an updated version. Here we have very much an urban, sophisticated group of people dressed in business suits, not quite the peasants who are pictured in this 1960s painting, who have come to the city from rural China to have their photograph taken. So here he is showing these, Wang Jinsong, showing these urban sophisticates. But the issue, the real issue here is, who are the people who have disappeared? Why aren't their faces there? And one assumes also that some of those may have been those who disappeared during the Tiananmen Square incident. Lei Jun is another. Here we have one proponent, a strong proponent of the political pop style. Here he's used a young portrait of Mao, but with a couple of slight affectations. One is the pink, the kind of magenta pink background. The other is the lotus blossom from Mao's mouth. And you might wonder why. I think, if anything, the lotus blossom we often identify with references to Buddhism. And if anything, Mao, especially during the Cultural Revolution, did much to ask that Chinese give up their religion in order to swear allegiance to the state, if not to even him in terms of the kind of cult leadership. So we have here a kind of an image at cross purposes, and certainly one that has a degree of irony to it. And of course, Guang Yi, whose works a number of years later, at the herald of this new decade, takes on a whole other spin, that you saw the image of Mao before. Now, Guang Yi is working within a framework that deals with the entry into China of multinational corporations. It's the beginning of consumerism, if you like. And so he's bringing together the vestiges of the communist ideologies symbolized here in the Cultural Revolution posters, the red, black, yellow, and white kind of color use as well. And yet he's also included this Tang logo. And some of you might remember the Tang drink, the orange kind of cordial, yes, from that we all used to drink. Well, I can remember being at operas in Beijing, and Tang was the drink to drink at intermission. So anyway, here he is kind of bringing together these two kind of competing ideologies that really started to take effect during this decade. Fang Lijun is another who's heavily associated with the cynical realism style. This is actually an image from a painting that was reproduced on the front page of the New York Times Magazine when we held our Inside Out New Chinese Art exhibition that I mentioned before. And it's interesting, there was a whole debate within China because the New York Times had said that this was that China growls. But some critics actually in China had written that it was more of a yawn. That in fact here, Fang Lijun was really dealing with kind of this disaffection of youth that happened in the 1990s, that there was a whole kind of movement of hooliganism, both in writing with the work of Wang Shuo, and here, of course, Fang Lijun was one of those young people living on the outskirts of Beijing. But I have to say that he, like many Chinese artists during this time, played with this idea of dissidence very astutely. That in fact, Fang Lijun was, like Zhang Shagang, his peer, were very savvy about working with museum exhibitions and gallery exhibitions outside of China. There was a younger generation of artists, in fact, who considered this generation of painters to be to have kind of sold out. I mean, this was even in the 1990s, and I'll go into their work in just a moment. But I want to focus our attention on Zhang Shagang because I think that, because of his market appeal, I think many people have, these works have almost become kind of over-reproduced. But when one sees them in the flesh, these early paintings, they are really quite wonderfully executed. That he is he's an artist who was trained in Sichuan Academy that has produced a lot of very good painters. And when they were done, like Guang Yi and even Fang Lijun's paintings, when they were done in their time in the early 1990s, they were actually very compelling paintings. Which is not to say when their works are done 2005 that they have the same kind of poignancy. But this work by Zhang Shagang, which is part of his Bloodline series, is one that harkens back again, like many of the other images, to the Cultural Revolution, this set of experiences that many of these artists grew up with. It's obviously a family portrait from this time, and we know that because of the figure's dress. But we also note that there is a thin blood line linking all of these figures. And if you see it, you should be able to see it here, right? And here. And I think that this bloodline refers on two levels to different things. On one level, it refers to the tradition of ancestor worship, of filial piety, very Confucian, that grounds in many ways Chinese traditions. But on the other hand, what happened during the Cultural Revolution with the idea of kind of cult worship of Mao was that many of these young people, like young members of this family, young pioneers, were asked to denounce their elders and sometimes even their parents or grandparents for various different reasons. And so there was a turn at which this kind of bloodline of filial piety was severed in place of an allegiance to the state or an allegiance to Mao. So I think that Zhang Shagang is talking about something that was at this time very complex, and yet the imagery today we've become, I think, rather desensitized to the power of this image as it was in the early 1990s. Now, I mentioned before this group of an older generation now. For some younger artists during the 1990s, they were considered the older generation who did very well with foreign collectors. There were lots of foreign collectors visiting their studios and near the Summer Palace. Now, for a younger radical group of artists like JungHwan, they were doing performance works. Now, when they did these performance works, they had no concept that their photographs would become part of a market system. So what we've found is that there are lots of these photographs floating around the place, taken by people who were there, taken by other artists. But JungHwan was the creator of many of these performances around the East Village. So just as the older generation were at the Summer Palace, the younger generation of artists founded their own place to live, if you like, looking for cheap rent on the outskirts of the city of Beijing. And they called it the East Village, in some ways as a reference to New York's East Village. People like Ai Weiwei had come back from New York to Beijing and had told taught this younger generation of artists about the active East Village, and so they founded their own. Some of these artists were in fact pursued by the authorities because, of course, naked performances were not quite acceptable. But for JungHwan's work, they really had, they nearly all had a kind of conceptual brief. So you'll note that the title refers very much to the action of the work. Here we have to raise the water level of a fish pond. So he worked with and kind of employed these itinerant workers. This was a time when Beijing was being rebuilt, that many of the hutongs, the traditional houses, were being destroyed and replaced with large apartment blocks. And of course, who was building these apartment blocks but itinerant workers from all over China who were descending on Beijing, but they did not have work units. So they settled in places with the artists on the outskirts of the city. And so JungHwan made use of these itinerant workers by using them sometimes in his performance works and sometimes also in collaboration with other artists. He himself is pictured here with the little boy on his shoulders. Or you have Ma Liuming, also part of the East Village. He himself created a kind of alter ego called Fang Lijun, and he dressed or kind of made up his face with makeup and did his hair. He was a very effeminate, beautiful looking man, and then he would do naked performances, and so he would play with this idea of gender. Was he male? Was he female? And then you have other performances in other parts of China, such as this one by Song Dong, who travelled to Tibet and proceeded to stamp the Lhasa River with a wooden stamp of the Chinese character for water. And so some have read this as a kind of critique of Chinese occupation that will never fully exist in Tibet because it's as hopeless as stamping the water. This was a series of photographs that captured the actual performance. Or Yin Shojun, who here has shown you various different portraits of her at the bottom of shoes that would have been worn by every woman in China at some stage in the 60s and 70s. In fact, probably up until the early 1990s, every woman wore these shoes in China. And I spoke before with JungHwan's work of this rebuilding of Beijing, that we assume that Beijing's main building campaign began with the Olympics, but actually the redesign of Beijing really happened throughout the 1990s decade. And Zhang Dali was one artist who really sought to capture this through photographs. His addition to all of this, of course, is this profile that he cut out or sometimes even spray painted in a graffiti-like style onto other buildings. But this is a wonderful image that captures the kind of looking through to see the Forbidden City. Now, when we come to the end of the 1990s, what we have is a kind of decade that was really about the internationalization of Chinese contemporary art, that the museum exhibitions of Chinese contemporary art had begun early in the decade in 1993, with the first exhibitions appearing in Hong Kong, Berlin, and Sydney, Australia. The kind of second wave of shows happening later in the decade happened here in the United States. So in many ways, the internationalization of Chinese contemporary art really happened during this decade with the museum and curatorial interest. Now, when we come to 2000 is kind of a turning point for the Chinese contemporary art scene, primarily because of the thawing in the relationship between the contemporary art world in China and the government authorities. That when China became part of the WTO, I think there was some sort of decision that Chinese contemporary artists no longer posed a direct threat to their authority. So what you had was a series of kind of efforts on the part of the government towards including Chinese contemporary artists, or at least allowing their work to be shown in public museums in China. So you had the first Shanghai Biennale in 2000-2001, curated by an overseas Chinese curator, Hu Hanru, which was the first occasion that international contemporary art and Chinese contemporary art was shown together in a public museum. It's often seen as something of a watershed moment. And so artists, with this kind of thawing of a relationship, started to do very different work. There was not so much of a kind of political inflection, nor necessarily references to the Cultural Revolution. So Wang Jinsong would, I think, represent a younger generation of artists' work who imagined the past, present, and future in this triptych of photographs. So here you have an image of the past. So here we have soldiers. He himself is shown as a soldier here, but a wounded one, paying tribute to the soldiers who are covered in clay and mud, but also reminiscent of the kinds of socialist realist sculptures that we still see at Tiananmen Square. So here we have the present as Wang Jinsong imagines it. Very much China as a manufacturing hub for the world. Instead of mud or clay, these images of workers, factory workers, are shown in silver, a semi-precious metal. And the artist here is shown as a young, urban sophisticate. Again, with kind of Western city clothes, a baseball cap. He even has a pet dog, which of course is a luxury. One needs a license to have a pet dog in China. And then finally we have the future as he imagines it. It's a much more static image, isn't it? It doesn't have the forward thrust that the artist has seen the past and the present. It's much more in the shape of a kind of diadem or crown, and of course it's gold, a precious metal. The artist is shown here in the centre with two pot lids, kind of like symbols, and also many images of prosperity, food baskets, lanterns for festivals and things like that. We saw this in some ways also as a reference to the Beijing Olympics because he's on a bicycle and China's aspirations towards satellite technology shown in the back. I mentioned before the role of diaspora artists, that in the 1980s, China was gripped by leave the country fever. Anybody who could leave left for opportunities abroad. Then in the 1990s, many of these diaspora artists living in places like New York, Paris, and even Sydney began to show their work on the international art scene and in many ways promoted an idea of Chinese contemporary art. They were artists who were really doing works about China, about being Chinese. And Tsai Guo-cheng, of course, is a very good example. He was recently honoured by not just a work by being commissioned by the Central Park Conservancy to celebrate their 100th year, but also by a major retrospective at the Guggenheim Museum. So what's interesting about Tsai, I think, and signals this kind of back and forth relationship, but also relationship and thaw with the government, was that he, of course, left China, but was invited in many ways to return, and most recently not only curated the government representation of the first China pavilion some years ago at the Venice Biennale, but also did the pyrotechnic display for the Olympics. So you see some contemporary artists choosing to work with the government in ways that possibly would have been inconceivable 2 decades ago. Part of this return has seen some artists return to set up studios. This is the studio of JungHwan, the man who did the conceptual performance works in the Beijing's East Village. He's almost all but given up his performance art practice when he returned to China to settle in Shanghai in 2005. he set up an enormous studio with nearly 100 staff members who created large-scale works that would have been unimaginable in New York. So here we have one such work in his copper welding studio, where he creates works that are based on Buddhist relics that he found mostly in Tibet, but just enough to give you a sense of the scale of the works. Or Yang Fudong, an artist, of course, of a different generation, born in the 70s, who in some ways is harking back to a Chinese past, but in a very different way from his peers. He's created a series of films that refer to the 7 intellectuals or 7 sages, a 3rd century Chinese motif often adopted in or played out in ink painting and decorative arts. But here he's reimagined it for the Shanghai context, and so we see 7 urban intellectuals in Shanghai making their way around different sites, Huangshan Mountain and others. Or you have Wang Jinsong, who has decided to do this steel sculpture about the newly emergent corporate culture in China. Remember, corporate culture did not exist in the 80s or largely in the 1990s. And here he's created the office equipment prototype, but you'll note very clearly that at any point that your body would come into contact with this work, it would feel like torture. So we have here, I'm sure many of you feel this way, having sat at a desk and computer for many hours. So each of these are blades. You see the manacles for the legs. This is a guillotine, right? And these are all sharp instruments. Or another artist called Shi Guorui, who attempts to capture the urban development that where, to the extent that now it's almost a cliche for us to talk about the rapid development in China. Well, Shi Guorui chose an old form of photography or technology, the pinhole camera, where he tried to capture Shanghai over a course of 2 days. And so you see here the negative effect, which is the effects of the pinhole camera. But let us remember that 2004 is a very particular moment in Shanghai's history, that if we had looked back even 10 years ago, none of this area, the Pudong, which now looks like a space-age city, right? None of this area would have even existed, that it was actually just simply rice paddies. So the artist is very well aware of how quickly things have changed and is attempting to capture it. Cao Fei, she also is commenting on this new corporate culture. She first began her practice in Guangzhou in southern China, which was in many ways the first place that really developed. It was part of a special economic zone, so it was really first to come into contact with much of this development. And she saw this rise of a young kind of yuppie class, those who worked in offices and had a penchant for Burberry bags and other kind of fashion icons. So here she's showing these young people dressed up as puppy dogs, but with Burberry fashion, wearing Burberry fashion. And of course, not all artists only work with the developments they see around them. Some also harken back to the past, although with a very self-conscious contemporary reference. This is the work of Wang Yi, who shows here his own body painted with a shanshui or traditional landscape that is posed in different ways with his hands. But we ultimately think of the tradition or the reference to tradition here as one that's fairly fragile, that it looks cracked, it looks as if it's something that can easily be washed off. And I think, if anything, the artist is perhaps commenting on the fact that it may, that this kind of visual tradition is one that he may believe will be lost one day. And then in terms of thinking through China today and some of the changes from a period in time in which artists had nowhere to show their work other than their own studios, because that was the only place that they could. We now have the development of a fairly robust gallery system in places like 798. This is an image of one of the first galleries that was established in the 798 complex in Beijing, which was called the Beijing Tokyo Art Projects. And it also signals that many foreign galleries have gone to China to set up shop. This is, of course, a Japanese gallery that has done this. And it's set up in an old factory area, and many of them have chosen to keep the Maoist slogans from the Cultural Revolution, inciting people to work. So this is a bit of an installation from a couple of years ago. And this is an image of Mogan Shanlu, the other gallery district in Shanghai. And this an image of the tank loft in Chongqing, attached to the art school. So all across China, there's a desire to establish these gallery districts, studio districts, to kind of to come to terms with this overall rise in interest in contemporary art. And of course, the missing piece in this, you might say, is the museums. Where are the museums? So more state-run or public museums have begun to show contemporary artists' work, and certainly the Shanghai Art Museum is key to that, with the Shanghai Biennale that's held every 2 years. But amongst that, you also have a slew of private museums that have been established. This is one such museum called the Today Art Museum. It was established a couple of years ago in another kind of gallery district area. And this was the first show, and I just showed this title wall to give you a sense that there is also corporate sponsorship, Mont Blanc. And you'll note that Fang Lijun was the first show, and so the similarities of his work today from the 1990s can clearly be seen. This is an image just taken a couple of weeks ago at the Ulen Center for Contemporary Art. This is a center for contemporary art that was established by Guy and Miriam Ulen's collectors, who mostly established one of the foremost collections of Chinese contemporary art. They were collecting about 10 years ago. And so they established this center in 798, and this is an exhibition of Yan Piming's work, who is an artist who, like many, left China, settled in Dijon and Paris, and then has returned to have his exhibition. Also has a studio in Shanghai. And then finally, we have an image of a private collector's warehouse on the outskirts of Beijing. His name is Guan Yi. You see an image here of two major sculptures, one by JungHwan. You'll see his figure there in the car. And also in the back is an image of Wang Yongping's bat plane, spy plane, fuselage project. It's a long story, but he did this work for the Guangdong Museum, and it was a major international incident because the French, US, and Chinese government got involved because he sought to replicate the US spy plane that, as you might remember, in 2001 crashed and the Chinese withheld it. And so it was a big incident. But enough to say that I wanted to end on this idea that, in fact, we see a much longer trajectory of Chinese contemporary art of at least minimum 30 years, which I think shows much more of a sense of depth and a greater dimension to the development of the art practices of these artists. And what is really needed today, I think, is museum attention. That in terms of museums, we've had the big shows of Chinese contemporary art, and now I think the next step, both within China and outside China, is collection building. And to some extent that is going on, but that's what's really going to make a difference in terms of our ability to study this work in the future. So with that, thank you very much.
Recently, it was last week in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, one of the two newspapers, they were mentioning auctions under the current economic situation, and how more and more of even the big auction companies like Christie's and Sotheby's are sticking to the tried and true as far as artists go for auctions. And the same is happening in Europe, supposedly. And in more local markets, they're like Detroit, they're sticking to, like, say, Michigan artists and Midwest artists, etc. What impact, if any, has this had on Chinese artists and exposure economically in these types of both big and small auction houses here in the United States?
Okay, so this is a market-related question, and as a museum director, I don't often comment on the market. But let me say that the market developed, okay, from 2005, as I mentioned. But what has actually happened is that it has, while it also began in New York, actually there are no designated Asian contemporary art sales in the United States at present, that it's all moved to Hong Kong. And I think that what we'll find in the future is that the bulk or the lion's share of collecting of Chinese contemporary art will occur in China. That we're at a very interesting moment right now where I saw a published survey maybe 8 years ago that said that 89% of Chinese contemporary art in collections was outside of China. And most of that was in Switzerland. Now, for those of you who are familiar with Chinese contemporary art, you know that that's probably one collector who was very active in assembling a major collection. So I think what we have is perhaps the diminishing or slight diminishing of foreign collecting interest. But at the same time, you have a strong rise in interest in the domestic market in China. And so you have a kind of an unusual moment right now. And I would say that the Chinese contemporary art collecting sphere was very unusual. I don't know of any other kind of art world where most of the collecting takes place outside of the country. Right? It was very unusual. So I think given the buoyancy of the Chinese economy right now and the fact that countless people are setting up collections and private museums and things like that, that really we're going to see that kind of shift of gravity go towards mainland China. And it's already happened in the antiquities side of things, so there's no reason to think that it won't happen on the contemporary art side of things.
My question was on, are there schools in China which are training their artists similar to, for instance, Yale has a notorious reputation for sending artists into the marketplace. Is China experiencing the same thing with its MFA equivalents?
The Chinese education system is very well developed, and I say that because the two major art schools, the Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing and the National Academy in Hangzhou, are considered the best art schools. They're very competitive to get into. Their graduation shows are very popular in collecting circles. So they do prepare artists for going out into the wide world, and yet that is a fairly recent phenomenon. It's really only since 2000, 2001 that I would say that was the case. Before that, the academy was really not a place that artists felt they could really experiment. Many of them still went to the Central Academy, but what they did after their academy training was completely different. Like all of these experimental artists, most of them went to the academy in some shape or form, but they certainly weren't doing work like that when they were there. However, in 2000, 2001, there was a general reform that brought together many of those experimental artists who were outside of the academy. They brought them into the fold. So, for example, Zhang Peili and Guan Yi, major figures in the experimental art world, especially in video art, were brought to the National Academy in Hangzhou to set up a new media lab. The same with Xu Bing. He was recently hired the vice president at the Central Academy. So we have here now much more of an integration between the experimental or the contemporary art world and the academy that is much more closer than it ever has been.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the differences between the art worlds of Shanghai, Beijing, and Hangzhou, and talk about how those differences are characterized, please.
So how much time do we have? For a long time, and we were actually talking about this beforehand, Beijing is very much considered the intellectual center of China. And for a long time, actually, if you wanted to meet with artists, you would simply go to Beijing because it was an enormous magnet that anybody who was ambitious enough to want to do art, to want access to collectors, because they all went to Beijing, they didn't go to Xi'an or Chongqing or any of the other places. You went to Beijing and you settled there. Now I think it's a little more diversified. However, Beijing is certainly the largest art scene. Shanghai, however, has great foreign appeal. I don't know a European who doesn't love Shanghai. It's a great setting, has good art schools, but in terms of the art schools themselves, Hangzhou is probably the other intellectual center, and in fact many in Hangzhou consider it the invisible intellectual center of China. Yes. Some professors say that. So, the differences are marked. And the thing with Shanghai, though, is that it has the Shanghai Biennale, which has the greatest kind of international recognition. So every 2 years, all the international curators, many of them go to Shanghai. So each has its own appeal and kind of relevance to the art scene. So they're very different, but still Beijing is the intellectual capital in many ways.
Just to follow up on that, I wonder if in recent years with rising rents in Shanghai and Beijing, if you've seen more experimental art coming out of the interior or out of second or third tier cities, and what differences that might bring to the market.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, you could travel to every city and still find a kind of art ecology. But to some extent, the rule of thumb that, as an artist, if you want to make it, it's still a bit of a prevailing idea that you must go to one city centre, whether it's Shanghai or Beijing, and mostly it's Beijing still. It's a little bit like here, you either go as an artist, there's a thinking that you go to art school in a centre, or you eventually make your way, at least for a time, to get some international experience to New York or LA or somewhere like that. So I think that certainly artists exist in these other areas. I mean, you could go to Harbin or Heilongjiang, you could go to any of these places, but in terms of the level of energy and the kind of intellectual circles that artists like to mix in, still the energy is really in the major centres, I think. Yeah. And then I think we had a question here.
Originally in the 80s, most paintings were very small and collectors could buy them. And what you're showing here, a lot of it seems to be institutional art. The scale is getting larger and larger and larger. And on a recent trip to Beijing, when we went to the art districts, it seemed like almost all the installations were so large that you'd have to put them in some place like the Xu Bing and the Freer Gallery or someplace in New York. Is this a trend that's increasing? I mean, are they creating art for collectors, or are they just creating art for institutions?
It's not just something that we see in China, actually. Over the past decade, we've seen a kind of supersizing of much contemporary art. Right? And what I would say, though, is in China, artists can have huge studios. They can make things that they would never be able to manufacture or have made if they lived in New York, just because of a simple scale issue. So we do find that there is an imagination that is on a supersize. I mean, I think it's also about living in China that, you know, when you talk to the Chinese government, everything is on a big scale. When you talk to them about museum loans, they say, how many works do you want to borrow from my museum? 1,000? You know, when the Chinese government makes an announcement about the numbers of museums that they're planning to build over the next decade, it's 1,000 new museums. So when you live in that kind of environment where size and scale is much larger than what we might be used to, then it starts to make you think in a different way too. Yeah. And we have a question down here.
Appreciate the long historical view you bring to this subject. I was wondering what you think of some other contemporary artists, such as Liu Xiaodong and his wife Yu Hong. My impression is that they're not as appreciated as some other, like Guan Yi or Zhang Xiaogang abroad. But at the same time, their art is truly fascinating because they speak directly to contemporary Chinese life. I also wondered, following that, as a museum director, what sort of directions you think we could do, what kind of things we can do to help audience outside China appreciate these two artists in particular and what they represent in general.
Yeah.
Thanks.
No, it's a good question. You know, Liu Xiaodong was just in an exhibition that I was involved in at the Central Academy, and you know, in China, he and Yu Hong are big stars. Actually, in the height of the market a couple of years ago, he did an exhibition which was a direct painting onto the wall, precisely because his paintings, in his view, had become too much of a market object. I would categorize his and Yu Hong's works more in terms of a realist trend. And the oil painting realist trend within China is alive and well. In fact, there's a whole swathe of artists who are heavily collected and supported in China. And Chen Danqing would be another artist who you might put in that category, who are less well understood outside of China. They haven't become part of, the kind of lexicon of what we might think of as Chinese contemporary. And there are lots of reasons why I think that realism itself is not a form that sits comfortably within the contemporary art world right now. There are exceptions, but generally speaking. So I think that when they do work within a Chinese context, it's very well understood, and they're great painters. But it's not easy to make their work necessarily understood outside of that context. I think in terms of where museums are heading, and it's certainly something that I've given this a lot of thought, because right now we're at a stage where most museums and audiences have had some contact with Chinese contemporary art within larger kind of group surveys. And I really think that our work, at least Asia's for my museum, we're really looking at two avenues. One is developing solo exhibitions by artists who have been underappreciated. That the time is kind of ripe. There is enough of a depth to many artists' work that you can show 15, 20 years of their work and give a sense of their artistic development. We did that with JungHwan just a couple of years ago, where we showed the development of his practice from his radical performances in Beijing to his group performances internationally when he moved to New York, and then his final phase of work when he moved to Beijing. So, you got a sense of the artist's story, but also the changes to his work that his personal biography made to that. And I think certainly other artists, we're working on an exhibition of Wu Guanzhong's work right now. So we're also looking at ink painters who really deserve much greater attention because we haven't focused on this area. Then the other side of things beyond the solo kind of more retrospective areas that allow us to go into greater depth with one artist is the kind of historical reappraisals. That we did a show called Art in China's Revolution last year, and that was an exhibition that focused on the period of the 1950s, 60s and 70s, including the Cultural Revolution. And this period, that especially the decade of the Cultural Revolution, is often thought of as a very dark period, and it certainly was. But when you look at a lot of these artists who were growing up, Xu Bing, Guang Yi, all of these others, a lot of them in interviews with me said, if you want to really understand my work, you have to go back to the Cultural Revolution. So we did a show that looked at how that iconography during that period was formed, what was the relationship that artists had to the state, and how has it become such an influential force in Chinese contemporary art today. So I think more of these questions need to be asked about the past, and probably the next step is early 20th century, So, and I think more and more museums are looking at this now that we've had the first introductory shows, which are very necessary actually. All too often I think we kind of we kind of say, oh, we don't like those national survey shows anymore. But actually, I think that they serve a certain function. You can't show one individual artist in a vacuum. People don't understand it. And we grapple with this issue all the time at Asia Society. So often there are certain steps along the way that you have to go along to develop more of a depth of understanding. So, yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you very much.